Good evening. The pill was white, small, scored down the center so it could be broken in half if the dose was too much, though the dose, as it turned out, was rarely too much at first. It crossed a pharmacist's counter in the autumn of 1981, slipped into an orange plastic bottle, and made its way into the hands of a woman in Ohio who had been told by her physician in plain and reassuring language that this was not a tranquilizer. That word, tranquilizer, had become radioactive by then. The country had spent 3 years watching the Valium scandal detonate in slow motion across newspaper front pages and Senate hearing rooms, and the word carried with it now a specific kind of shame. The tranquilizer was what had trapped 15% of the adult American population in a dependency that the pharmaceutical industry had promised, or for nearly 2 decades was impossible. The tranquilizer was what had sent Barbara Gordon, a successful Manhattan television producer, into a psychiatric ward so severe that she wrote a best-selling book about it. The tranquilizer was what the senators had been shouting about in September of 1979, while physicians publicly confessed they had become addicted to the free samples mailed to their offices by Hoffman LaRoche. The pill in Ohio was not a tranquilizer. It was something new, something faster, cleaner, more precisely targeted. The physician had said the words anti-panic medication, and they had sounded modern, scientific, hopeful. They had sounded like a correction to everything that had gone wrong before. Her name was Xanax. And what the physician did not say, what the pharmaceutical executives in Kalamazoo, Michigan, had taken great care to ensure would not be said, not in those terms, not yet, was that the molecule inside that white pill carried within its very structure the blueprint for a dependency more rapid, more neurologically violent, and in some documented cases more physically dangerous than anything Valium had ever produced. This is the history of Alprazolam, the safe alternative, the careful correction, and the pill that turned out to be an answer to the wrong question, asked in service of the right profit. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into history give you somewhere to rest, take a moment now and hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll always find your way back here when the night is long. Drop a comment too, and tell me where in the world you are tonight. It moves me every time to know how many corners of the earth gather here in the dark. But for now, settle in and let us begin. It is worth understanding, before anything else, what the pharmaceutical landscape looked like in the closing years of the 1970s. Because without that landscape, the decisions that produced Xanax do not make the particular kind of sense they need to make. By 1974, more than 59 million Valium prescriptions had been written in the United States in a single year. 59 million. The number is worth sitting with for a moment because it is not simply a prescription figure. It is a portrait of a nation that had decided, somewhere in the previous decade, that the ordinary distress of modern life was a medical problem requiring a pharmaceutical solution, and that the solution, as the industry had helpfully made available, was a small yellow or blue tablet developed in the New Jersey laboratories of Hoffman LaRoche by a Polish chemist named Leo Sternbach, who had been looking for something, anything, better than the barbiturates that were quietly killing people in their sleep. Valium was, by almost every measure of the 1960s, a miracle. It was effective. It was not instantly fatal if taken in excess. It calmed the trembling hands of men who had returned from wars they could not speak about, quieted the spiraling thoughts of women in suburban houses who had no language yet for what was wrong with them. It did not knock you unconscious in the way that a barbiturate would. It simply took the edge off the world, softened its sharpest corners, made the impossible feel merely difficult. And it did all of this so efficiently, so seamlessly, that the doctors who prescribed it, general practitioners primarily, not psychiatrists, men who had 30 patients a day and 7 minutes per appointment, began to write the prescriptions reflexively, the way they prescribed blood pressure medication or antibiotics, without particular thought for the long-term architecture of what they were building inside their patients' nervous systems. The long-term architecture, as it happened, was a cage. The reports began accumulating in the early 1970s, not loudly, not with the urgency they would eventually acquire, but steadily in medical journals and case files and the private conversations of physicians who had begun to notice something troubling in patients who had been taking Valium for years and then tried to stop. The stopping was the problem, and the stopping produced symptoms that looked to the untrained eye like an acute return of the anxiety the drug had been treating. But that were, in fact, something else entirely. Something the neuroscience of the time was only beginning to find the language for. Symptoms that included sweating and tremors and sleeplessness, and in some cases, something far more alarming than any of those, grand mal seizures, the kind that seize the whole body, the kind that can, under the wrong circumstances, stop a heart. By 1979, the accumulation had become impossible to ignore. Senator Edward Kennedy convened hearings before the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, and what unfolded in those hearing rooms over the course of that autumn was something the pharmaceutical industry had worked hard to prevent: a public accounting. 10 physicians took the stand and described treating patients who had become physically dependent on a drug they had been assured carried no meaningful risk of dependency. Former Valium users described withdrawal experiences that sounded, in the careful language of Senate testimony, like a particular kind of private hell. Dr. Joseph Birch, who had treated Betty Ford for her substance dependencies, testified on the dangers of the class, and Hoffman LaRoche, whose executives appeared to defend their product, deployed an argument that would become achingly familiar in the decades that followed, that the problem was not the drug, but the doctors who had overprescribed it and the patients who had misused it. It did not play well. The public had heard the assurances before. The credibility gap was too wide now, too deep, too well documented in the testimony of ordinary people who had taken what their doctors gave them and found themselves trapped in something they had not been warned about and did not understand. The word tranquilizer had acquired a specific moral weight. It meant a thing that captures you while promising to free you. It meant a lie told in a white coat, in a pleasant office, with a pen moving across a prescription pad. And in Kalamazoo, Michigan, at the headquarters of the Upjohn Company, the executives who had been watching these hearings with the focused attention of men whose industry was on trial, understood something with crystalline clarity. The market for tranquilizers was not dead. It was reorganizing. There were still millions of Americans who could not sleep, could not quiet the electrical storm in their chests, could not sit through a dinner party without their hands shaking. The need had not gone away. The need, if anything, had intensified because the 1970s had delivered economic anxiety and social fracture and the particular modern exhaustion of living in a country that expected you to be perpetually functional while offering you fewer and fewer structures within which to be human. The need was real. What had collapsed was not the demand. What had collapsed was the credibility of the vehicle. They needed a new vehicle. They needed a molecule that did everything Valium did, but that came dressed in different language, different marketing, a different origin story. And critically, they needed a molecule that moved fast enough, was specific enough in its claimed action, that it could be positioned not as a tranquilizer, but as something more targeted, more modern, more defensible. Something that a physician could prescribe in the aftermath of the Kennedy hearings without feeling the particular embarrassment of a man repeating a mistake. The molecule they had was already sitting in the files. Dr. Jackson Hester Jr. had been working in Upjohn's medicinal chemistry division since the late 1960s. A quiet, methodical man, by all accounts, more interested in the relationship between molecular structure and pharmacological activity than in anything that happened in boardrooms or hearing rooms. He was not, in the portraits his colleagues later painted, a man who thought in terms of markets. He was a man who thought in terms of chemistry, and the chemistry he had been working with was a refinement of the benzodiazepine class. A new subclass he had helped develop called triazolobenzodiazepines, in which an additional chemical ring structure, a triazole ring, was fused to the standard benzodiazepine framework in order to modify the compound's biological activity. The modification did several things. It made the molecule more potent, significantly more so. 1 milligram of what would become alprazolam was pharmacologically equivalent to roughly 20 milligrams of diazepam, the generic name for Valium. This was not a casual difference. This was a difference in the order of magnitude, a difference that meant an effective dose could be dramatically smaller, which was useful in terms of marketing. Smaller pills, lower dosages on the label, or the appearance of a more restrained, more precise pharmaceutical intervention. But the modification did something else, something more consequential, something that the engineers at Upjohn understood in pharmacokinetic terms, even if they did not, in the documents that survive, linger on its implications for dependency. The triazole ring altered the rate at which the body metabolized the compound. Valium was what pharmacologists call a long-acting benzodiazepine. Its half-life, the time it takes for the concentration in the bloodstream to fall by half, ranged from 20 to 100 hours depending on the individual, their age, their liver function. This meant that Valium lingered. It accumulated in the body over repeated doses. It cleared slowly. And this slowness was double-edged. It contributed to the sedation and the cognitive fog that made Valium feel heavy, felt like the tranquilizer it was. But the slowness also provided a buffer. The nervous system never experienced an abrupt withdrawal because the drug never left abruptly. Alprazolam was different. Its half-life ranged from approximately 6 to 27 hours. At the lower end of that range, in people who metabolized it quickly, which included a significant portion of the population, the drug could clear the system within a single day. And in a patient taking multiple doses per day, as the prescribing guidelines would recommend, the blood concentration could drop significantly between doses. Even while the patient was theoretically still medicated, the body, which had begun to reorganize its neurochemistry around the presence of the drug, experienced that drop as a a specific, urgent neurological signal. The signal was, something that was here is now gone, and the nervous system, being the adaptive, compensatory system that it is, responded accordingly. This was not a secret. It was a pharmacokinetic reality that any medicinal chemist with a working knowledge of benzodiazepine metabolism would have recognized. The relationship between half-life and withdrawal severity was not a mystery in 1969 or 1971 or 1981. The barbiturate literature had established it clearly decades earlier. The early benzodiazepine literature had reinforced it. Short-acting compounds in this class of drugs had always produced more rapid onset of withdrawal symptoms than long-acting ones. As this was not a contested finding, it was, in the quiet language of clinical pharmacology, a known quantity. What was contested, what Upjohn would spend enormous resources contesting, marketing around, and strategically obscuring, was the question of whether alprazolam's short half-life meant its dependency profile was more dangerous than Valium's. The company's position, built into its marketing from the first press of the tablet, was that alprazolam's precision, its speed, its targeted action, distinguished it from the blunt instrument benzodiazepines of the previous generation. It was not a tranquilizer. It was an anti-panic medication. The word itself reframed the entire clinical relationship, from sedation to treatment, from chemical quieting to pharmacological cure. Upjohn did not want doctors thinking about half-lives. It wanted doctors thinking about panic, about suffering, about a medication that could bring a patient relief within 20 minutes of the first dose. The relief was real. That is the part that makes this history tragic rather than simple. Alprazolam genuinely worked. For the anxiety that was tearing through the nervous systems of millions of Americans in 1981, it provided a form of calm that felt, to the person experiencing it, like rescue. The 20 minutes between swallowing the pill and feeling the tidal pull of the GABA system engaged, the slowing of the catastrophic mental spiral, the physical unwinding of muscles that had been clenched for months. This was not nothing. This was, for many people, the first moment of peace they had felt in years, and the physicians who prescribed it, who watched their patients' faces change in the consulting room, who received the grateful phone calls, who saw blood pressure readings drop and sleep logs improve. These physicians were not foolish or corrupt. Most of them were practicing medicine in good faith, with the information they had been given, in a country that desperately needed someone to help its people rest. That is the first weight this history carries. Not the conspiracy theory version, in which every physician and regulator was complicit, and every patient was naive. The more sorrowful version, in which a genuine pharmaceutical achievement, a molecule that provided genuine relief, was positioned in a way that obscured a genuine risk in service of a genuine profit motive, and the people caught in between were simply the people who needed help. By October 16, 1981, and the FDA had granted approval. Upjohn had produced approximately 50 double-blind studies demonstrating alprazolam's superiority over placebo and its equivalence to, or improvement over, other treatments then available. The approval was based on 2 large randomized trials showing short-term efficacy and acceptable tolerability. What those trials did not, and by their design could not show, was what happened when people took the medication not for 4 weeks, but for 4 months or 4 years. What happened in the long, slow accumulation of days when the nervous system had reorganized itself so completely around the presence of the drug that the drug had become, quietly and without the patient's knowledge or consent, a structural necessity. What happened, in other words, and when the short half-life began to do what its structure had always promised it would do. The pill crossed the pharmacist's counter. It made its way into millions of orange plastic bottles, into medicine cabinets in Ohio and Texas and Oregon and Florida, into the purses of women who had been told they were not being given a tranquilizer, and the briefcases of men who had been told the new medication was precise, targeted, safe. And in the boardrooms of Kalamazoo, Michigan, in the winter of 1981 and 1982 and 1983, something else was happening. Something that would take years and one very significant piece of published research to fully understand. Upjohn was not only selling a pill, it had, in the years leading up to that approval, been doing something far more architecturally ambitious. It had been building the disease. There is a question that sits at the center of this history, quiet and patient, waiting to be asked properly. The question is not whether panic disorder is real. It is. The experience of a panic attack, the sudden, overwhelming surge of terror that arrives without warning or apparent cause, the racing heart, the chest that feels like it is collapsing inward, the absolute animal certainty that you are dying, is one of the most acutely distressing experiences the human nervous system is capable of producing. People who have lived through panic attacks do not require a diagnostic manual to tell them that what happened to them was significant. Their bodies remember it. Their lives are reorganized around the fear of it happening again. The question is different from that. The question is, who decided that panic was a discrete medical condition separate from anxiety, requiring its own diagnosis, its own treatment protocol, and its own line item in the most influential psychiatric reference document in the world? And what were their relationships, financial and otherwise, with the company that was, at that precise moment, preparing to bring to market the first pharmaceutical product specifically designated to treat it? That question, followed carefully and honestly, leads somewhere that takes a moment to absorb. It leads to a story about how modern medicine creates its categories, and who benefits when those categories are created in a particular way, at a particular time, with a particular treatment already waiting in the wings. To understand what happened with the DSM-III, it is necessary to go back further. Back to 1964 and to a psychiatrist named Donald Klein, working at Hillside Hospital in New York. Klein was, by the accounts of his peers, a rigorous and genuinely curious clinician, a man who paid close attention to patterns in his patients that other physicians had learned to overlook. And the pattern he noticed in the early 1960s was this. Some of his patients who experienced what the diagnostic language of the time called anxiety neurosis, a broad, capacious category that covered most presentations of excessive fear or worry, responded in a distinctive and unexpected way to a particular class of antidepressant medication called imipramine. Specifically, the imipramine appeared to block the acute, episodic surges of panic they experienced, while having little effect on the background hum of chronic anxiety that persisted between those surges. Klein's interpretation of this observation was significant. He proposed that the acute surge, the panic attack, was a neurobiologically distinct phenomenon from ordinary anxiety. Not an extreme point on the same continuum as the prevailing thinking held, but a categorically different event, with a different biological substrate, a different mechanism, and therefore a different treatment requirement. In the language of his 1964 paper, he was beginning to articulate what would eventually become the clinical concept of panic disorder as a discrete diagnostic entity. This was, taken on its own terms, a legitimate scientific hypothesis, and the question of whether panic attacks are biologically distinct from generalized anxiety remains genuinely complex and contested even today, with researchers finding evidence on multiple sides of the argument. Klein's observation about imipramine was real. His clinical instinct that the episodic, explosive nature of panic attacks suggested something neurologically specific was happening was not unreasonable. Science advances through exactly this kind of careful clinical noticing. But here is the part that requires attention. Klein's early research, the work that began establishing panic as a distinct condition, was funded by Gagey Pharmaceuticals and Smith, a Klein and French, two pharmaceutical companies with obvious commercial interests in the expansion of diagnosable psychiatric conditions and the corresponding expansion of the pharmaceutical market for treating them. This was not unusual for the era. Academic psychiatry in the 1960s and 1970s was deeply enmeshed with pharmaceutical funding in ways that are only now, decades later, being fully examined. But it is a fact that belongs in the room when the rest of the story is told. Because Donald Klein did not stay in his laboratory. His ideas traveled. They were persuasive, carefully articulated, and, critically for what followed, they arrived at exactly the right moment in the history of American psychiatry. On the DSM-III, the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published in 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association, and it represented something more than a revised reference document. It represented a fundamental restructuring of how American psychiatry understood and communicated about mental illness. The previous edition, DSM-II, had been organized around psychodynamic concepts rooted in Freudian theory, broad impressionistic categories that reflected the clinical tradition of talking cures and unconscious conflict. DSM-III was a deliberate and explicit rejection of all of that. It was an attempt to make psychiatric diagnosis look more like the rest of medicine, specific, categorical, symptom-based, replicable, a checklist of observable criteria rather than a narrative of unconscious dynamics. This was, in many respects, a genuine scientific advancement. The reliability problems with DSM-II, different clinicians diagnosing the same patient with wildly different conditions, were real, and the move toward more standardized, criteria-based diagnosis addressed them meaningfully. But the shift also had a less examined consequence. Categorical diagnosis requires categories, and categories, once created and given official names, acquire a gravity of their own. They shape what clinicians look for. They shape what patients report. They shape what insurance companies will and will not reimburse. And they shape, with particular force, on what pharmaceutical companies can develop drugs to treat, because a drug cannot be approved for a condition that does not officially exist. Donald Klein served on the Anxiety and Dissociative Disorders Subcommittee of the DSM-III Task Force. His influence on the committee was substantial, and in the final published edition of DSM-III in 1980, panic disorder appeared as a discrete diagnostic category for the first time, separated from generalized anxiety disorder, given its own symptom criteria its own code, its own clinical identity. Anxiety neurosis, the broad holding category of DSM-II, under which panic had previously been subsumed, was effectively dissolved. What had been a continuum was now a series of distinct conditions, each with its own borders, its own name, and its own implicit invitation for pharmaceutical intervention. Our panic disorder was, as of 1980, a disease. And in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Upjohn had been watching this process with the focused attention of a company that had a very specific reason to care about its outcome. The details of Upjohn's engagement with the psychiatric community in the years leading up to the DSM-III publication are not, in their individual pieces, dramatic. There was no single meeting, no smoking document, no moment of explicit corruption that a historian can point to and say, "Here, precisely, is where the line was crossed." What there was, instead, was something more characteristic of how pharmaceutical influence actually operates. A sustained, well-resourced campaign of scientific sponsorship, conference funding, clinical education, and research support are directed at the precise community of researchers and clinicians whose work and whose consensus would determine whether Upjohn's new compound had a commercially viable disease to treat. Upjohn funded research into panic disorder. It sponsored symposia, at which the emerging science of panic as a discrete biological entity was presented and debated. It cultivated relationships with the key opinion leaders in anxiety research, the psychiatrists whose papers other psychiatrists read, whose presentations other clinicians attended, whose clinical frameworks shaped how general practitioners thought about their anxious patients. This was not bribery in any simple sense. It was something more structural, the systematic alignment of corporate resources with the scientific questions whose answers the corporation most needed answered in a particular way. And the result, when it arrived, was almost perfectly timed. DSM-III, published in 1980, Panic Disorder, a recognized, codified, officially designated medical condition. Xanax approved by the FDA on October 16, 1981. Indication: the treatment of anxiety disorders, including panic disorder. The interval between the condition's official creation and the arrival of its designated pharmaceutical treatment was less than 14 months. Among insiders, among the psychiatrists and researchers who watched this sequence unfold with varying degrees of discomfort and admiration, the new diagnosis acquired an informal name. They called it, and in the half-joking language of people who understood exactly what they were observing, the Upjohn illness. The Upjohn illness. A condition whose emergence from the pages of the most authoritative psychiatric reference in the world coincided with remarkable precision with the commercial needs of a pharmaceutical company in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that had spent years and enormous resources ensuring that when the diagnostic moment arrived, it would arrive with a molecule already prepared to meet it. It is worth pausing here because this is the part of the story that is easiest to misread in either direction. The misreading in one direction says, panic disorder was invented by a pharmaceutical company. It is not real. The people who experience it are not genuinely suffering. This reading is wrong, and it is a harmful wrong. Because panic disorder is real, its suffering is real, and the millions of people who have been helped by treatment, including pharmaceutical treatment, deserve not to have their experience dismissed in the service of a polemical point. The misreading in the other direction says, pharmaceutical companies fund research all the time. DSM-III was developed by serious scientists. and the emergence of panic disorder as a diagnostic category reflects genuine clinical observation rather than corporate manipulation. This reading is also incomplete because it treats scientific processes as though they occur in a vacuum, unseduced by money, undistorted by the interests of those who pay for them. The accurate reading sits in the more uncomfortable space between those two positions. Panic disorder is real. The clinical observations that motivated its separation from generalized anxiety were genuine. But the speed and the specificity with which it was codified as a discrete, biologically distinct condition requiring dedicated pharmaceutical treatment was shaped by corporate interests that had a profound stake in a particular scientific outcome. The DSM-III process, whatever its genuine scientific achievements, was also a site of pharmaceutical influence. And the result of that influence was not merely an academic classification change. It was the creation of a market. Because here is what the formal recognition of panic disorder as a discrete condition did, practically and commercially. It gave Upjohn something that no amount of advertising could have purchased on its own: clinical legitimacy. It meant that physicians treating patients who had previously been told they had generalized anxiety or anxiety neurosis, or simply that they were nervous people in a nervous world, now had a specific diagnosis to give them. A specific, modern, scientifically credentialed diagnosis that implied a specific, targeted treatment. And when they turned to the clinical literature to identify that treatment, Upjohn had already placed its evidence there in the form of 50 double-blind studies demonstrating alprazolam's efficacy for precisely this condition. The FDA, reviewing Upjohn's application, took note of something unusual in the company's submission. Because Upjohn had already spent millions of dollars funding the clinical research that established panic disorder's existence as a distinct entity, the agency determined that it did not need to require the same level of comparative placebo data it would typically demand of a new medication entering an established category. Upjohn had, in effect, constructed the evidentiary landscape so thoroughly that the regulators were navigating terrain the company had already mapped. The trials that would have most clearly revealed the dependency risk, longer-term studies tracking what happened when patients tried to stop, were not required. The short-term efficacy data was, for the purposes of approval, sufficient. Within 2 years of its approval, Xanax had become the most prescribed psychiatric medication in the United States. By 1985, sales would exceed $150 million in a single year, an 85% increase over the previous year. By 1988, prescriptions had grown by 72% over the 1984 baseline. The numbers are not simply measures of commercial success. They are a measure of how completely Upjohn had succeeded in reframing the conversation. From tranquilizer dependency to panic disorder treatment, from the discredited pharmaceutical inheritance of the Kennedy hearings to the bright clinical promise of a new biological psychiatry that understood what was really wrong with you and had a precise, modern, carefully studied answer. The psychiatrists who prescribed it were not, for the most part, cynical. They believed they were practicing evidence-based medicine. They believed the studies they had read at the conferences Upjohn had sponsored, the papers whose research Upjohn had funded, and the clinical frameworks they had absorbed from the opinion leaders whose careers Upjohn's research grants had supported. They believed they were offering their patients something that the previous generation of physicians had failed to offer: a targeted treatment for a real, neurobiologically grounded condition. They believed, with the particular faith that medicine reserves for its newest and most scientifically credentialed tools, that they were helping. And for a significant number of their patients, in the short term, they were. This is the weight of it. This is why the history of Xanax is not a story about villains and victims in the simple sense. It is a story about what happens when a genuinely effective short-term treatment is positioned through a combination of scientific influence and strategic marketing. It's as a long-term solution to a condition whose boundaries were drawn, at least in part, by the company that held the treatment. It is a story about the particular danger of institutions that are trusted precisely because they look like science. Peer-reviewed journals, diagnostic manuals, FDA approvals, randomized controlled trials, and how that trust can be exploited without ever producing a single obviously forged document. The disease was real. The treatment worked. The dependency risk was known, not to every prescribing physician, not to every patient, but to the researchers inside Upjohn, who had been watching what happened in the clinical trials that were not published, the data sets that accumulated in the filing cabinets of Kalamazoo, while the marketing department prepared the next conference brochure. It was known to the pharmacologists who understood what a short half-life meant in a drug of this class, in patients taking it 3 and 4 times a day for months and years rather than weeks. And it was beginning in the early 1980s to become known to the patients themselves, because by then the nervous system had its own opinion about the Upjohn illness. And the nervous system, as it turned out, was not confused about what was happening to it. The nervous system was not fooled by marketing language or reassured by clinical framing or persuaded by the 49 positive studies out of 50 that Upjohn had submitted to the FDA. The nervous system simply responded to what was present and what was absent, to the molecule when it arrived, flooding the GABA receptors with artificial calm, and to the gap that opened in the hours before the next dose, when the molecule had cleared faster than the system could compensate, and the silence where the calming signal had been filled instead with something that felt, to the person experiencing it, very much like the panic that the drug was supposed to have cured. That process, what it does to the living brain, to the actual cellular machinery of human consciousness, is where this history goes next. Begin with the brain. Not the brain as metaphor, not the brain as the seat of personality, or the house of the soul, or any of the other beautiful fictions we have constructed around it over the centuries. Begin with the brain as what it actually is. A 3-pound electrochemical organ of staggering complexity, humming with the continuous signaling of roughly 86 billion neurons, and each one communicating with thousands of others through a system of chemical messengers so intricate and so precisely balanced that the wonder is not that it occasionally fails, but that it functions at all. That balance, the balance between excitation and inhibition, between the neurons that fire and the neurons that quiet the firing, is the thing that matters for this story. Because what Alprazolam does at its most fundamental biological level is intervene in that balance. And what happens when the brain adapts to that intervention, as it always does, because adaptation is what brains do, is the thing that the marketing materials for Xanax were never designed to explain. The quieting side of the brain's signaling system runs primarily on a single neurotransmitter, gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA. It is the nervous system's primary inhibitory messenger, the chemical signal that tells neurons to slow down, to reduce their firing rate, to step back from the edge of excitation and return to a baseline of calm. And when you feel the natural unwinding of a long exhale, the settling of your body into a chair at the end of a difficult day, the gradual loosening of the muscles in your shoulders as you move from alertness into rest, GABA is substantially responsible for that. Not entirely, not simply. The nervous system does not work in single variable equations, but GABA is the central pillar of the inhibitory architecture, and when that pillar is strong and responsive, the system tends toward equilibrium. The anxiety disorders, the genuine clinical anxiety that drove people to physicians' offices in the millions throughout the 1970s and 1980s, involve, at least in part, a dysregulation of this system. The inhibitory signals are insufficient, or the excitatory signals are overwhelming them, or the balance point has shifted in ways that make the nervous system chronically prone to states of alarm. The fear response activates too easily, takes too long to quiet, floods the body with stress hormones in response to threats that are not physically present. This is not a character failing. It is a neurological state with biological substrates and measurable physiological correlates. The suffering it produces is real. Benzodiazepines work by intervening at the level of the GABA receptor, specifically a subtype called the GABA-A receptor. These receptors are pentameric structures, meaning they are assembled from 5 protein subunits arranged around a central channel, and they operate as gatekeepers. When GABA binds to the receptor, the gate, a chloride ion channel, opens, allowing negatively charged chloride ions to flow into the neuron, hyperpolarizing it, making it less likely to fire. The neuron quiets. The inhibitory signal is transmitted. Benzodiazepines do not bind where GABA binds. They bind at a separate site on the same receptor complex, what pharmacologists call an allosteric site. And their effect is not to replace GABA, but to enhance it. In the presence of a benzodiazepine, the GABA-A receptor becomes more responsive to GABA's signal. The chloride channel opens more frequently. The inhibitory effect is amplified. The result, felt from inside the nervous system, is the particular quality of calm that Alprazolam produces. Not sedation exactly, not sleep, but a lowering of the gain on the alarm system. The catastrophic spiral of anxious thought loses its momentum. The chest unclenches, the hands stop shaking. The world becomes for a few hours manageable again. This is the mechanism of relief, and it is genuine relief. That cannot be overstated because the rest of what follows makes no sense without first accepting that the drug works. In the short term, for acute anxiety, for panic that has made a person's life unlivable, Alprazolam delivers what it promises. The GABA enhancement is real. The calm is real. The patient's experience of rescue is real. The problem is what happens next. The brain is not a passive recipient of chemical signals. It is a dynamic, adaptive system, constantly monitoring its own state and adjusting its architecture in response to the conditions it encounters. This is one of its most extraordinary properties, the capacity for neuroplasticity, for reorganization, for learning. But that same adaptive capacity means that when you introduce a chemical that consistently amplifies the inhibitory signal, the brain will, over time, respond by recalibrating. Specifically, it will downregulate. Downregulation in this context means a reduction in the number and sensitivity of GABA-A receptors available to respond to inhibitory signals. The brain, experiencing what it registers as an excess of inhibitory activity, compensates by making itself less sensitive to that activity. It reduces receptor density. It alters receptor subunit composition. It adjusts the threshold at which the inhibitory signal produces its effect. It is, in the most precise possible sense, turning down its own volume on the quieting channel, because the drug has been turning it up so consistently that the brain has concluded the quieting channel must be recalibrated to prevent excessive suppression. Simultaneously, the excitatory systems, particularly the glutamate system, operating primarily through receptors called NMDA and AMPA receptors, begin to upregulate. They become more sensitive, more responsive, more easily activated, as the brain attempts to restore its internal balance by enhancing the excitatory side of the equation to compensate for what it perceives as excessive inhibition on the other. The result of these two processes together, GABA downregulation and glutamate upregulation, is a nervous system that has been structurally reorganized around the presence of the drug, as a nervous system whose natural inhibitory capacity has been diminished and whose excitatory reactivity has been enhanced precisely because the drug has been doing the inhibitory work so reliably that the brain has offloaded that function to the chemical. This is physical dependence, not addiction in the colloquial sense, not craving, not compulsive drug seeking, not the moral failing that the word addiction has been made to carry in popular discourse. Physical dependence is a neurological state. It is the state in which the drug is no longer supplementing the brain's function, but has become, in a very real biological sense, part of it. The drug is no longer treating a disease. It has become an architectural component of the system that was once capable of regulating itself. And when the drug is removed, or when its concentration in the bloodstream drops significantly between doses, the consequence follows with a logic that is, once you understand the underlying neuroscience, almost inevitable. The inhibitory signal falls. The brain's own inhibitory capacity, having been downregulated, cannot compensate quickly enough. The excitatory systems, having been upregulated, surge forward into the space the drug has vacated. The nervous system, stripped of the chemical that has been doing its quieting work, lurches toward hyperexcitability. The alarm systems activate. The stress hormones flood. The muscles tighten. The thoughts accelerate. The heart rate climbs. This is withdrawal. And it does not look from the outside like a drug problem. It looks, with an accuracy that is clinically bewildering and corporately convenient, almost exactly like the condition the drug was prescribed to treat. Now, here is where the short half-life becomes something other than a pharmacokinetic detail. Valium's long half-life, 20 to 100 hours, meant that the process of clearance from the bloodstream was gradual. A patient who missed a dose or who was slowly tapering off the medication experienced a slow, relatively smooth decline in plasma concentration. The nervous system had time, not enough time, not time that made withdrawal comfortable or safe, but some time, to begin its own compensatory adjustments before the concentration dropped to the level at which the withdrawal state became acute. The descent was, if not gentle, at least measured. Alprazolam's half-life of 6 to 27 hours meant something categorically different for a patient taking the drug 3 or 4 times a day, as the prescribing guidelines recommended for panic disorder. Between each dose, the plasma concentration dropped sharply. Not to zero. The drug was still present, but significantly, and in a nervous system that had down-regulated its GABA receptors in response to the drug's constant presence, Even a significant drop in concentration was enough to trigger the withdrawal cascade. The excitatory systems, poised and sensitized, did not wait for the drug to fully clear. They responded to the relative absence, to the gap between the concentration that the brain had been calibrated to expect and the concentration that was actually present. This is interdose withdrawal, and it is one of the most clinically significant and least publicly discussed phenomena in the entire history of benzodiazepine pharmacology. The patient taking alprazolam 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, evening, may begin to experience, in the hours before each dose, a return of anxiety symptoms that is not simply their original anxiety reasserting itself. It is, neurologically, a withdrawal state, a mild, subclinical withdrawal state, cycling through their nervous system multiple times per day, intensifying slightly each time, as the cumulative effect of repeated downregulation makes the gap between doses more pronounced. The nervous system's own inhibitory capacity further diminished, the rebound excitation more insistent. The clinical consequence of this cycle is significant. The patient, experiencing anxiety in the hours before each dose, attributes that anxiety to the condition they are being treated for, and concludes that the medication is working, that it is holding the panic at bay during the hours when it is at therapeutic concentration, and that the return of symptoms is evidence that they need the drug rather than evidence that the drug is producing the symptoms. The drug, in other words, generates the evidence for its own necessity. The dependency becomes self-concealing, and the physician, seeing a patient whose anxiety reliably responds to alprazolam and reliably returns when the dose wears off, may reasonably and incorrectly conclude that the treatment is appropriate and necessary for the long term. And the seizure risk is where this neuroscience becomes not merely clinically significant, but acutely dangerous. The hyperexcitability produced by GABA downregulation and glutamate upregulation is not simply uncomfortable. It is, under the right conditions, seizurogenic, capable of producing seizures. Neurons firing in uncontrolled, synchronous cascades. The electrical storm that is a grand mal seizure is the extreme manifestation of the same excitatory surge that underlies the anxiety, the tremors, the racing heart of withdrawal. It is not a separate phenomenon. It is the same phenomenon at a different point on the intensity spectrum. Case reports of withdrawal seizures following abrupt discontinuation of alprazolam began appearing in the medical literature in the early and middle 1980s. Not theoretical projections, documented cases. Now, patients who had been taking alprazolam at therapeutic doses for therapeutic durations, in some documented instances as little as 10 weeks, and who, when the drug was stopped abruptly or reduced too rapidly, experienced seizures. One particularly important review in the published literature noted that seizures in this context were more likely to occur with short-acting benzodiazepines than long-acting ones, and that they could emerge as early as 24 hours after the last dose in patients on short-acting compounds, not several days later. Not in the context of dramatic overdose, within 24 hours of a person simply stopping a medication their physician had prescribed them. It is important to be precise here, as this history requires precision, and as the safety directive governing this account requires equal precision. The seizure risk in benzodiazepine withdrawal is not a risk that can be self-managed. It is not a risk that responds to willpower or gradual effort or the kind of careful self-monitoring that patients understandably attempt when they decide they want to stop taking a medication. It is a medical risk requiring medical supervision because the nervous system's trajectory during benzodiazepine withdrawal is not reliably predictable from the patient's experience of the previous days. A person who feels manageable on one day may not be manageable on the next. The physiology does not announce itself in advance. This is stated here not as guidance. This account offers none, but as context for understanding what the physicians who were prescribing Alprazolam in the early 1980s were, in most cases, are not being told about the medication they were handing their patients. The dependency profile that produced this risk was understood in pharmacokinetic terms by the researchers who had designed the compound and the clinical researchers who had studied it. It was not being communicated with the clarity and urgency it deserved to the general practitioners and psychiatrists who were writing the prescriptions. And it was not being communicated at all to the patients who had been told in the explicit and reassuring language of the original marketing campaign that this was not a tranquilizer, that it did not carry the heavy, lingering addiction of the drugs that had come before. There was a particular cruelty in that formulation when you understand the neuroscience, because the claim was technically defensible in a narrow sense, as Alprazolam did not produce the heavy, lingering dependency of Valium. Its dependency was not heavy and lingering, it was acute and rapid. The withdrawal, when it came, did not unfold over the slow weeks and months that Valium withdrawal sometimes required. It came faster, it came harder. The very mechanism that made the drug feel cleaner, the short half-life, the rapid clearance, the modern precision of a compound that moved in and out of the system efficiently, rather than accumulating in fatty tissue for weeks, was the mechanism that made the dependency more vicious, not less. Upjohn had not solved the Valium problem. It had compressed it. It had taken the gradual unfolding of a long half-life dependency and collapsed it into a cycle of daily interdose withdrawal and acute cessation seizure risk that was, and by any honest clinical measure, a more neurologically dangerous situation for many patients than the one it had replaced. The marketing language was not lying precisely. Alprazolam was not Valium. It was different. It was faster. It was more potent per milligram. It cleared more quickly. All of those things were true. What the marketing language had carefully avoided saying was that faster and more potent and shorter acting were not, in the specific pharmacological context of a drug that works by hijacking the brain's inhibitory architecture, synonyms for better or safer. They were synonyms for different, and in important ways, for the patients who found themselves unable to stop, they were synonyms for worse. The woman in Ohio whose prescription we have been carrying through this history. She did not know any of this in 1981. Her physician did not know most of it. The FDA reviewers who approved the drug knew some of it, but were not required, by the structure of the approval process, to demand the kind of long-term safety data that would have made the picture clearer before the drug reached her hands. What she knew was that the pill worked, that the hours after she took it were manageable in a way the hours before it had not been. That when she tried in the spring of 1983 to go a day without it, because she was going to visit her sister and did not want to bring the medication, did not want to be seen as someone who needed medication, the day did not go well. The anxiety that returned was not simply her old anxiety. It was something sharper, something with an electrical quality to it, on something that climbed her chest and lodged behind her eyes, and made her hands shake in a way that she had not experienced before she started taking the drug. She took the pill. The shaking stopped. She told her physician at the next appointment that she did not think she could manage without it. Her physician agreed and wrote another prescription. That appointment, multiplied by the millions, is what the commercial explosion looked like from the inside. And in the offices of Upjohn, the numbers were accumulating in a way that should have prompted a very particular kind of question. A question that the company's own scientists, in the results of a study they had commissioned and would soon receive, were in the process of answering. The answer was not the one Upjohn had paid for. The numbers arrived the way commercial victories always do in the pharmaceutical industry. Not as a single announcement, but as a steady, accelerating accumulation of data that translated quarter by quarter into something that looked, from the inside of Upjohn's headquarters in Kalamazoo, like vindication. But in the months following the October 1981 approval, prescriptions were modest. The drug was new, the condition it treated was newly codified, and physicians, even physicians who had been attending the conferences and reading the studies and absorbing the clinical framework that Upjohn had spent years carefully constructing around panic disorder, required time to adjust their prescribing habits. Medicine moves by accretion. It changes through repetition and reinforcement, through the gradual accumulation of confident colleagues, through patients who ask by name for what they have been told will help them. But by 1983, something had shifted. The prescribing patterns had crossed a threshold that no one in the industry had publicly projected, though privately, it's in the long-range forecasting documents that pharmaceutical companies produce for their investors. The trajectory had been anticipated with reasonable accuracy. By 1983, Xanax had become the most prescribed psychiatric medication in the United States. Not the most prescribed benzodiazepine, the most prescribed psychiatric medication of any kind in any category. The drug that had been approved less than 2 years earlier for a condition that had not officially existed until the previous year had climbed to the peak of American psychiatry faster than any comparable compound in the history of the class. The velocity of that ascent is worth examining, because it did not happen by accident, and it did not happen purely because the drug worked. Upjohn's marketing apparatus in the early 1980s was, by the standards of its era, extraordinarily sophisticated. The company had understood something that its competitors in the benzodiazepine space had not fully grasped in the aftermath of the Kennedy hearings, that the collapse of Valium's reputation was not a crisis for the category, but an opportunity for whoever moved fastest to occupy the newly vacated position of the credible, evidence-based, scientifically legitimate anxiolytic. The public and the medical community had not concluded that anxiety disorders should go untreated. They had concluded that Valium was a dangerous and discredited way to treat them. The gap between those two conclusions was the commercial space that Xanax was engineered, as much as any pharmaceutical product can be engineered, to occupy. The strategy had several interlocking components, and each reinforcing the others in a way that made the whole more powerful than the sum of its parts. The first component was the clinical evidence base. Upjohn had produced approximately 50 double-blind studies prior to approval, a number that was, even by the ambitious standards of pharmaceutical trial programs, extraordinary. 50 studies meant that when a skeptical physician or a careful regulatory reviewer or a journalist writing about the new drug went looking for evidence, They found evidence, not thin evidence, not marginal evidence, but a dense, cross-referencing, mutually reinforcing body of published research demonstrating alprazolam's efficacy for anxiety and panic. The sheer volume of the evidence performed a function beyond simple proof. It performed authority. An drug with 50 studies did not look like a product being pushed by a company with a profit motive. It looked like science. The second component was the clinical education campaign. Upjohn's medical representatives visited physicians' offices with a message that was carefully calibrated to the post-Valium moment. They were not selling a tranquilizer. They were explicit about that, and the explicitness was itself a form of credibility, because it acknowledged the disaster that had preceded them and positioned alprazolam as the correction to it. They were offering, instead, a targeted treatment for a specific, biologically grounded condition. They brought the studies. They brought the reprints of the conference presentations. They brought the message that panic disorder was real, that it was diagnosable, as that patients who had previously been dismissed as simply anxious people were in fact suffering from a neurobiologically distinct condition that responded to a specific pharmacological intervention, and that the intervention was available, was approved, was evidenced, was safe. The third component, less visible but no less important, was the continued sponsorship of the scientific infrastructure around panic disorder. Upjohn funded what it called the Cross-National Collaborative Panic Study, a multi-center trial involving nearly 1,700 patients across 14 countries, the largest clinical trial ever conducted in panic disorder at the time. The study generated data, generated publications, generated a scientific literature that cemented panic disorder as a clinical reality and alprazolam as its primary pharmaceutical treatment. It also generated relationships with the researchers who ran the sites, the clinicians who enrolled the patients, the institutions whose names appeared on the published papers. Relationships that constituted a network of scientific credibility that the company could draw on in the conference room and the regulatory hearing and the peer-reviewed journal. By 1985, Xanax's annual sales had climbed to more than $150 million. The increase from the previous year was 85%. The prescription volume was growing at 72% over the 1984 baseline, a trajectory that would continue with only minor variations for years. And the commercial machine was operating at a scale and efficiency that even Upjohn's most optimistic internal projections had not fully anticipated. And somewhere in that machine, in a filing cabinet in Kalamazoo, the first troubling signals were beginning to accumulate. They did not arrive dramatically. They arrived the way unwelcome scientific findings always arrive, in the careful, qualified, heavily footnoted language of medical case reports, slowly gathering in journals that most prescribing physicians did not routinely read, raising questions that the clinical education materials being distributed by Upjohn's medical representatives were not designed to answer. The withdrawal seizure reports were among the earliest. Individual case reports published in the mid-1980s and documenting patients who had been taking alprazolam at therapeutic doses for therapeutic durations, weeks, not years, and who, when they stopped or significantly reduced their dose, experienced grand mal seizures. The reports noted, with a clinical precision that made the implication unavoidable, that seizure risk in benzodiazepine withdrawal was specifically elevated with short-acting compounds. They noted that the onset could come within 24 hours of the last dose. They noted that the risk appeared to be present even in patients who had not taken doses above the recommended range, and even in patients who had been taking the medication for periods that the prescribing guidelines had described as short-term. The reports accumulated. They were not individually definitive, but they were case reports, the lowest tier of clinical evidence, subject to confounding, unable to establish causation with the certainty of a controlled trial. But they were consistent, and they were describing something that the 50 double-blind studies in Upjohn's evidence base had not been designed to detect, because those studies had been designed to measure efficacy over weeks, not to track what happened when patients tried to stop. Upjohn's response to these accumulating signals was the response of a company that understood that scientific credibility, once established, could be defended by scientific means. The company did not dismiss the case reports. It commissioned research. It funded the kind of large, well-designed, methodologically rigorous study that could, in principle, either confirm or refute the emerging picture. And the study it funded would eventually become one of the most significant and most uncomfortable pieces of research in the entire history of Alprazolam. Dr. Isaac Marks was a British psychiatrist of considerable reputation, based at the Maudsley Hospital in London, with a career built on rigorous research into the treatment of anxiety and phobic disorders. Dr. Richard Swinson was his Canadian counterpart, based in Toronto. Together, they led what became known as the London-Toronto Study, a multi-center, controlled trial designed to assess the efficacy of alprazolam against panic disorder and agoraphobia, including a comparison with exposure therapy and a follow-up period that extended well beyond the treatment phase. Upjohn funded it. Upjohn, presumably, he hoped to fund a study whose results would look like the 50 studies that had preceded it. Another entry in the dense, cross-referencing body of evidence that demonstrated alprazolam's place as the designated treatment for panic disorder. That is not what the study found. The London-Toronto study began with 154 subjects divided across 4 groups: alprazolam with relaxation therapy, placebo with relaxation therapy, alprazolam with exposure therapy, and placebo with exposure therapy. The treatment phase ran for 8 weeks. Then the patients were tapered off their medication over the following 8 weeks. Then they were followed for a further period without treatment or medication, through to week 43. The results during the treatment phase were broadly consistent with Upjohn's previous data. Alprazolam produced short-term symptom reduction. Patients in the alprazolam groups showed improvement in panic frequency, in phobic avoidance, in overall symptom severity. The drug worked. Across 8 weeks, the efficacy signal was real. But the follow-up data told a different story. A profoundly different story. When the researchers examined what had happened to the patients in the alprazolam groups after the medication was discontinued, in the weeks and months of follow-up that constituted the portion of the study Upjohn had not anticipated, would be its most revealing. They found that those patients had fared significantly worse than the placebo groups. Specifically, the alprazolam-treated patients showed higher rates of relapse, greater symptom severity at the follow-up assessments, but had more difficulty maintaining the gains they had achieved during treatment once the drug was no longer present. The drug that had been marketed as the treatment for panic disorder was, when its long-term trajectory was examined in a well-designed, Upjohn-funded clinical trial, associated with worse outcomes in the condition it was supposed to cure. The short-term relief came at the cost of long-term recovery. The nervous system that had been quieted chemically had not been healed. It had been borrowed against, and when the loan came due, when the drug was removed and the nervous system was required to manage on its own, it was less capable of doing so than it had been before treatment began. Dr. Marks described Upjohn's reaction to these findings with a precision that left little room for interpretation. The people at Upjohn, he said, were not happy at all about the study. The company had paid for research that demonstrated its flagship product worsened the long-term trajectory of the condition for which it was the designated treatment. The study was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 1993. It was not suppressed. The journal published it. The researchers presented it. The data entered the scientific record. But what followed publication was, in its own way, as revealing as the findings themselves. Upjohn continued marketing Xanax. It continued sponsoring conferences. It continued funding the clinical education apparatus that had made Alprazolam the most prescribed psychiatric medication in the country. It engaged with the Marks-Swinson findings in the literature, disputing the methodology, questioning the follow-up protocol, offering alternative interpretations of the data, and did so with the same resources and the same organized scientific credibility that it had deployed to build Alprazolam's reputation in the first place. The study existed, the data existed, and the marketing continued. This is the moment, this specific moment, the moment in which Upjohn received evidence from its own funded research that its product worsened the disease it was marketed to treat and proceeded. That answers the question the hook opened with. What did they know and when did they know it? They knew by 1993, with the certainty of their own data, that the long-term prescription of Alprazolam for panic disorder produced outcomes that were measurably worse than the outcomes produced by placebo with behavioral therapy. Or they knew that the withdrawal process created a clinical picture indistinguishable from the relapse of the original condition. A picture that would encourage continued prescribing rather than discontinuation. They knew about the seizure risk in abrupt cessation. They knew about the interdose withdrawal cycle and its capacity to make patients believe they needed the drug rather than understanding that the drug was producing the symptoms. They knew, in the accumulated evidence of the case reports and the clinical trial data and their own funded research, that they had not solved the dependency problem that had destroyed Valium's reputation. They had, in important ways, that the clinical literature was documenting with increasing clarity, replicated it, and the prescriptions continued. By the early 1990s, Alprazolam had become the most prescribed benzodiazepine not only in the United States, but in significant portions of the world. The clinical infrastructure Upjohn had constructed, the diagnostic category, the evidence base, the conference networks, the opinion leaders, the peer-reviewed literature, had achieved a momentum that was, by then, largely self-sustaining. Physicians trained in the 1980s had been trained to regard panic disorder as a discrete biological condition, and Alprazolam as its appropriate treatment. They passed that training to the residents they supervised. The medical education system embedded the framework. The insurance reimbursement codes recognized the diagnosis. The pharmacies stocked the drug, and the patients arrived with the language their doctors had given them and left with the prescription that language authorized. The machine, once built, did not require Upjohn's hand on the lever to keep running. It ran on institutional inertia, on the accumulated weight of a decade of scientific credibility, on the faith that physicians and patients and regulators placed in a system that looked at every level of its operation like evidence-based medicine. It looked like evidence-based medicine because, in its constituent parts, it largely was. The studies were real, the peer review was genuine, the clinical observations were accurate. The drug worked, in the short term, for the condition it was approved to treat. The architecture of harm was not a forgery. It was something more difficult than a forgery to dismantle, because it was built from genuine materials assembled in a pattern whose full shape only became visible when you stood far enough back to see the whole of it. And by then, tens of millions of people were taking the drug. The woman in Ohio, the man in Texas, the teenager in Oregon, whose panic attacks had made school impossible, and whose physician had said, with genuine compassion, that there was a medication that could help. The retired teacher in Florida who had been taking 2 milligrams 3 times a day for 7 years, and whose hands shook now, not from anxiety, but from something her nervous system had come to require. In the same quiet, insistent way, it required oxygen and water and sleep. All of them were inside the machine, and the machine, as machines do, continued. What it could not do, what no commercial apparatus, however sophisticated, could entirely prevent, was stop the questions from accumulating, the patients who could not stop, the physicians who noticed the pattern, the researchers who published the data that Upjohn had not paid for and did not welcome, the regulatory bodies that watched the case reports pile up and considered, slowly, what obligation they bore to the people taking the drug. The reckoning, when it came, would take longer than it should have. It would arrive incomplete. It would leave most of the architecture of harm intact. But it would come. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that is harder to name than corruption and harder to fix than incompetence. It is the failure that happens when a system operates exactly as designed, when the regulators follow the rules, when the physicians practice within the guidelines, when the companies submit the studies and receive the approvals and market the products through the approved channels. And the outcome is still catastrophic for a significant number of the people the system was built to protect. It is the failure that hides inside process, that wears the clothing of due diligence, that produces at every step documentation suggesting that the appropriate people asked the appropriate questions and received answers that, at the time, in the framework available, seemed adequate. The history of Alprazolam in the 1990s is that kind of failure, and it is important to understand it as such rather than as a simpler story, rather than as a tale of obvious villains and obvious negligence, because the simpler story, however satisfying, does not explain how the same failure has been repeated, with variations, across the arc of pharmaceutical history, and why the repetition continues. By the early 1990s, the clinical world inhabited by American psychiatry had reorganized itself in ways that made the Alprazolam situation structurally stable, even as the evidence base surrounding it was becoming increasingly complicated. The reorganization had happened at multiple levels simultaneously. At the level of diagnostic culture, panic disorder had been in the DSM for a decade. It was no longer a new or contested category. It was a clinical reality, taught in medical schools, coded in insurance systems, embedded in the training of a generation of psychiatrists and general practitioners who had learned to recognize its symptoms with the same confidence that they recognized hypertension or diabetes. The condition had acquired the particular solidity of established medicine, the solidity that comes not from being proven beyond all doubt, but from being repeated often enough, in enough authoritative contexts, that questioning it requires a kind of institutional courage that most individual clinicians understandably do not possess in the middle of a busy practice. At the level of prescribing culture, Alprazolam had achieved something similar. By the early 1990s, it was not simply a medication that physicians were choosing from among several options. It was, if for panic disorder, the expected option, the thing a competent physician prescribed when the diagnosis was made, the treatment that patients arrived having already researched, having already heard about from family members or friends, or the expanding ecosystem of popular health journalism that was translating psychiatric research into magazine articles and daytime television segments. The drug had achieved what pharmaceutical strategists call category ownership. It did not merely treat panic disorder. In the cultural imagination of American medicine, it had become synonymous with its treatment. And in 1990, Upjohn received a formal expansion of Alprazolam's approved indications from the FDA, and the drug that had been approved in 1981 for generalized anxiety disorder was now explicitly approved for panic disorder as well, the condition whose diagnostic category had been shaped, at least in part, by the company's own scientific investments a decade earlier. The expanded indication was accompanied by a new marketing push, a new wave of conference presentations, a new set of reprints distributed to physicians' offices. The cycle that had produced the original explosion in prescriptions now had a formal regulatory imprimatur to accelerate it. The prescriptions climbed. They climbed through the early 1990s and through the middle of the decade and into the late 1990s, sustained by the institutional momentum of a drug that had been embedded across 15 years into the prescribing reflexes of American medicine. By the mid-1990s, the tens of millions of Alprazolam prescriptions were being written annually in the United States. The numbers were no longer climbing at the extraordinary rate of the mid-1980s, but they were not falling either. They were simply present, a steady, enormous volume of pharmaceutical consumption that had become, in the actuarial sense, ordinary. Ordinary. That word is worth pausing on because it contains the whole shape of what had happened. The drug that had been introduced as a revolutionary departure from the discredited tranquilizers of the previous era had become, within a decade and a half, the new ordinary, the new background radiation of American pharmaceutical life, the thing that millions of people took every day, in the morning and at noon and in the evening, not because they had weighed the evidence and made an informed choice, but because their physician had prescribed it, because it worked, because stopping had proven to be more difficult than continuing, and because the system surrounding them, the medical system, the insurance system, the pharmacy system, the cultural system, had organized itself around their continued consumption of it in a way that made continuation the path of least resistance. And the patients who could not stop, who tried repeatedly and found that what awaited them on the other side of stopping was a neurological experience they could not manage, who returned to their physicians with descriptions of withdrawal symptoms that the prescribing information had not prepared those physicians to recognize as withdrawal. Those patients encountered something that has been documented with painful consistency and in the accounts of people who lived through it. They were not believed, not universally, not in every consulting room, with every physician, in every circumstance, but with sufficient consistency to constitute a pattern of patients presenting with symptoms that were, in neurological fact, manifestations of benzodiazepine withdrawal, and being told by their physicians that what they were experiencing was a return of the underlying anxiety disorder. Being told that their difficulty stopping the medication was evidence that they needed it. Being told, in some cases, that benzodiazepines did not produce the kind of dependency they were describing, because the physician had been trained in a framework sustained by 2 decades of pharmaceutical marketing and clinical education that positioned Alprazolam as a targeted treatment for a specific condition rather than as a drug capable of producing physical dependency in patients who took it as prescribed. The patients who tried to articulate what was happening to them, who tried to explain that the symptoms they experienced when they reduced their dose were different from the anxiety they had been treated for, more acute, more physical, more electrical in quality, accompanied by sensations that had never been part of their original presentation, often found that the language available to them was inadequate to the task. The medical vocabulary for what they were experiencing was thin, contested, not yet organized into the kind of clear diagnostic framework that would have given their physicians a way to recognize and name it. And without the name, and the recognition was difficult, and without the recognition, the help was not forthcoming. The benzodiazepine injured community, the people who had been harmed by long-term prescribing of drugs like Alprazolam and had spent years trying to taper off them with inadequate medical support, was not, in the 1990s, a recognized clinical population. It was a scattered, largely invisible group of people who had found each other in the margins of the medical system, in support groups and letters to patient advocacy organizations. And as the decade progressed, in the early online forums that were beginning to allow people with shared experiences to find one another across geographic distances that would previously have kept them isolated. What they shared across those forums and those letters and those support groups was not simply a complaint about a drug. It was something more specific and more troubling, a description of a medical experience in which the system responsible for their care had failed to recognize the harm it was doing, had attributed that harm to the underlying condition rather than to the treatment, and had responded to their attempts to communicate about it with a combination of well-meaning dismissal and institutional incapacity that left them without recourse. They were, in a structural sense, inside the same dynamic that had trapped Valium patients in the 1970s. The details were different, the drug was different, the diagnostic framework was different, but the core architecture, a medication that produced dependency, a medical system that had not been prepared to recognize that dependency, a pharmaceutical company that had invested enormous resources in a clinical narrative that made the dependency difficult to see, was recognizable. It was, in important ways, the same architecture running on a faster molecule. The parallel to 1979 was not lost on everyone. In the medical literature through the 1990s and into the 2000s, a growing body of research was complicating the simple clinical story that the Upjohn marketing materials had told. Studies examining long-term outcomes for benzodiazepine users were finding evidence of cognitive effects, difficulties with memory, with processing speed, with the kind of sustained attention that daily functioning requires, that persisted beyond the period of acute use. Studies examining the dependency profile of short-acting benzodiazepines were confirming in controlled settings, what the case reports of the 1980s had suggested, that alprazolam's withdrawal syndrome was more severe, more rapid in onset, and in some respects more clinically dangerous than that of the longer-acting compounds it had been positioned to replace. The Marks-Swinson findings, published in 1993, had entered the literature and stayed there, quietly cited, periodically re-examined, never refuted, never adequately incorporated into the clinical mainstream. Upjohn's objections to the methodology had been answered in subsequent analyses. The finding that Alprazolam-treated patients fared worse at follow-up than placebo-treated patients had been replicated in different forms in other research. The evidence was accumulating with the slow, patient authority of science that has been correct all along and is simply waiting for the institutions around it to catch up. The institutions were slow. The FDA, which had approved Alprazolam in 1981 on the basis of short-term efficacy data, did not move quickly to require the kind of long-term safety studies that the accumulating evidence suggested were necessary. The agency operated within a framework that placed the burden of post-approval safety monitoring on a system of voluntary adverse event reporting, a system that, by its voluntary nature, captured only a fraction of the harm occurring in the broader patient population, and that was structurally poorly designed to detect the kind of diffuse, long-duration harm that benzodiazepine dependency produced. Patients who experienced difficulty stopping Alprazolam did not, for the most part, file adverse event reports. They called their doctors. They went back to their pharmacies. They suffered in the ordinary ways that people suffer when a medical treatment has gone wrong, in the private spaces of their homes and relationships and working lives, invisible to the regulatory apparatus that was supposed to be watching. The reckoning, when it finally arrived in formal regulatory terms, took 39 years. In September of 2020, the Food and Drug Administration issued a requirement that all benzodiazepine medications, including Alprazolam, update their prescribing information to include what the agency calls a boxed warning. The boxed warning is the most serious category of safety communication available to the FDA within the existing approval framework. It is the black-bordered notice that appears at the top of a drug's prescribing information, in language specific and unambiguous enough to ensure that no physician reading it can claim they were not informed. The 2020 boxed warning stated, in terms that the clinical literature had been supporting for decades, that the physical dependence and withdrawal reactions associated with benzodiazepines could be severe and could include life-threatening consequences. It stated that abrupt discontinuation or rapid dose reduction could precipitate acute withdrawal reactions, including seizures. It stated that these risks applied to patients who had taken benzodiazepines at therapeutic doses for as little as a few weeks. It stated that the symptoms of withdrawal could persist for months or years. Months or years. The language of the warning, when read carefully, describes something that the marketing materials of 1981 had been specifically designed to prevent anyone from imagining. It describes a drug that can, in patients who have taken it as their physician prescribed it, produce a withdrawal syndrome of such severity and such duration that it constitutes a significant and lasting medical event. Not a brief period of discomfort, not a few difficult days before the body readjusts. A withdrawal process that can extend in some patients for periods that reshape their relationship with their own nervous system for years. 39 years. The gap between October 16th, 1981, the day the FDA approved Alprazolam, and September 2020, the day the agency required the warning that the drug's own early clinical literature had contained the seeds of, is 39 years. And in those 39 years, Alprazolam had been prescribed to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It had become, in the 2020s, the 37th most prescribed medication in the United States, with more than 15 million prescriptions written in a single year, despite everything that was by then known about its dependency profile. It is worth sitting with that number, 15 million prescriptions, in a single year, for a drug about which the regulatory agency had, in the same decade, issued its most serious category of safety warning. The warning did not reduce prescribing to a meaningful degree. The institutional momentum was too great, the prescribing habits too embedded, the clinical framework too deeply constructed. And for a boxed warning, however serious in formal regulatory terms, to do more than add a paragraph to a document that most patients never read and many physicians reviewed only cursorily. The machine continued, the prescriptions continued, the patients continued to take what their doctors gave them, and the doctors continued to give what their training had prepared them to give, and the system continued to produce, quietly and at scale, the harm that 39 years of accumulated evidence had documented with increasing clarity and decreasing effect. The question that this history insists on, the question that the entire arc from Hester's laboratory in the late 1960s to the FDA's 2020 warning demands, is not difficult to formulate. It is only difficult to answer honestly. Did the system that approved, marketed, us and normalized Alprazolam learn anything from Valium? The evidence suggests a partial answer. It learned the language. It learned to say anti-panic medication instead of tranquilizer. It learned to position dependency as a manageable risk rather than an inherent property. It learned to fund the diagnostic category before the drug rather than after it. It learned to produce more studies, more evidence, more clinical infrastructure, so that the next reckoning would take longer to arrive and find more to dismantle when it did. What it did not learn, what the 39-year gap between approval and honest warning suggests it was structurally incapable of learning within the framework it operated, was how to prioritize the long-term safety of the people taking the drug over the short-term commercial interests of the people selling it. And it did not learn that the same qualities that make a drug effective in the short term, the rapid onset, the powerful relief, the dramatic improvement in acute symptoms, can be the precise qualities that make it dangerous in the long term. It did not learn that the clinical trial, designed to demonstrate efficacy over weeks, is the wrong instrument for understanding a drug whose harms unfold over years. And so, in the absence of that learning, the architecture of harm was not dismantled. It was not corrected. It was not replaced by something more honest. It was updated. The new version ran faster. It was marketed better. It came dressed in more compelling science. And it had, by the early years of the 21st century, acquired a dimension that the Upjohn executives of 1981 could not have anticipated, a dimension that did not originate in any pharmaceutical boardroom, was not shaped by any clinical trial, and could not be managed by any marketing campaign. It had acquired a counterfeit. There is a particular cruelty in dying from something you believed you knew, not from an unknown substance, not from a reckless experiment, not from the kind of dramatic pharmaceutical encounter that the public imagination tends to associate with overdose, but from a pill that looked exactly like the pill you had taken before, That had the same color, the same shape, the same scored line down the center, the same imprint pressed into the surface with the same pharmaceutical precision. A pill you held in your hand and recognized, the way you recognize something ordinary and safe and familiar, and swallowed without hesitation because you had swallowed it before and understood from that experience what it would do to you. This is the texture of what began happening with accelerating frequency sometime around 2019. And it is happening still. The counterfeit pharmaceutical market in the United States is not a new phenomenon. Fake pills have existed as long as there have been pills to fake, and the motivations of the people who manufacture them, profit primarily, the exploitation of a market created by prescription scarcity, and the economics of addiction, have remained consistent across decades. What changed in the years following 2015 and accelerating dramatically through the early 2020s was the chemistry. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl, a synthetic opioid of extraordinary potency, developed originally as a surgical anesthetic capable of producing respiratory depression and cardiac arrest at concentrations measured in micrograms, had, by the middle of the 2000s and 10s, become the dominant adulterant in the American illicit drug supply. Its appeal to the people who manufacture counterfeit pills is straightforward and terrible. It is cheap to produce, extraordinarily potent in tiny quantities, and capable of being pressed into a tablet with the same pharmaceutical equipment that produces convincing imitations of legitimate medications. A kilogram of fentanyl, acquired at wholesale prices from illicit chemical manufacturers operating primarily in China and Mexico, could produce hundreds of thousands of individual pills. The profit margins were, by any measure of the illicit economy, extraordinary. The three pharmaceutical products most commonly targeted for fentanyl substitution were, by the late 2000s and into the 2020s, oxycodone tablets, cocaine, and alprazolam. The Xanax bar, the rectangular multi-scored tablet in 2 milligram strength that had become one of the most recognizable pharmaceutical forms in American popular culture, are referenced in music and film and social media with a casualness that reflected how thoroughly it had been normalized, became one of the primary vehicles through which illicitly manufactured fentanyl entered the bodies of people who believed they were taking something they understood. The counterfeit bars were, to visual inspection, indistinguishable from their pharmaceutical counterparts. The pill presses available on the illicit market had become sophisticated enough to reproduce the surface imprints, the scoring, the color, the dimensions of legitimate alprazolam tablets, with an accuracy that could deceive not only the casual observer, but in some cases, people who had been taking pharmaceutical alprazolam for years and believed they could recognize the genuine article. The imprint codes that appeared on counterfeit bars, the stamped alphanumeric identifiers that are supposed to allow a pharmacist or physician to identify a tablet's manufacturer and contents, were reproduced faithfully, lending the fake pills the specific visual authority of the real ones. What was inside was not what the surface promised. The CDC's State Unintentional Drug Overdose Reporting System tracked what happened next with the cold precision of epidemiological surveillance. Between July 2019 and December 2021, the proportion of overdose deaths with evidence of counterfeit pill use more than doubled nationally, from 2% of all overdose deaths in the first period to nearly 5% by the end of 2021. In the western United States, where the counterfeit supply had penetrated more deeply and earlier, The increase was more severe. The proportion more than tripled, from under 5% to nearly 15% of all overdose deaths in those jurisdictions. The people dying were disproportionately young. Nearly 60% of the deaths with evidence of counterfeit pill use involved people under 35. They were people who had, in many cases, a history of legitimate benzodiazepine prescription. People who knew what Alprazolam felt like, who had taken it at some point through legal channels, who believed that familiarity constituted a form of safety, who did not know, because there was no way for them to know without laboratory testing, that what they had obtained looked like what they had taken before, but contained instead a substance whose lethal dose was measured in the millionths of a gram, 2 milligrams of fentanyl, and the quantity that fits on the tip of a pencil, the quantity that can, in a person without opioid tolerance, and benzodiazepine users who had no particular reason to have developed opioid tolerance, were precisely that category of person. Stop the respiratory system with a completeness and a speed that allows no time for intervention, no moment of recognized distress, no opportunity for the people nearby to understand what was happening before it was finished. The fentanyl-laced counterfeit bar did not produce an overdose that announced itself. It produced a quieting. A person who took a pill they believed they recognized felt the familiar onset of sedation and did not wake up. Found in the morning by a roommate or a parent or a partner who had watched them take what they thought was a medication they had taken before, and who would spend the rest of their life rearranging their understanding of a moment that had looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. It is necessary here to be precise about what the counterfeit crisis is and what it is not, because precision is what this tragedy deserves, and imprecision would compound the harm. The people dying from fentanyl-laced counterfeit Alprazolam bars are not dying because they were reckless. They are not dying because they failed to understand pharmacology. They are dying because they made a trust assumption. The trust assumption that a pill which looks like a known medication is a known medication. That was reasonable in every world except the specific world that the illicit fentanyl economy had created. They are dying because the visual language of pharmaceutical legitimacy and the very language of imprints and scoring and color consistency that the FDA designed to protect patients had been reproduced by illicit manufacturers with enough fidelity to defeat the only safety check available to someone obtaining pills outside the pharmacy. And they are dying in a dimension that connects this contemporary tragedy to the full arc of the history we have traced tonight. Because Alprazolam had become, through decades of prescribing culture, through its normalization in popular media, through its status as one of the most recognized pharmaceutical forms in American life, the specific pill that a significant population of people trusted on sight. The counterfeit manufacturers did not choose Alprazolam arbitrarily. They chose it because it was familiar, because the familiarity created demand, because the demand created a market, and the familiarity that created the demand had been built across 40 years by the same institutional apparatus whose earlier decisions we have been examining throughout this account. The Upjohn illness, in its final and most terrible iteration, had become a vector for a different poison entirely. It is time now to name the 3 betrayals, not as an accusation, though accusation would not be unwarranted, as a structure, as the shape that this history actually has, when you stand far enough back to see the whole of it. The first betrayal was scientific. Jackson Hester's triazole ring produced a molecule that was faster, more potent, and shorter acting than the benzodiazepines that preceded it. The pharmacokinetic consequence of that shorter half-life, a more rapid, more severe, even more neurologically dangerous withdrawal syndrome than Valium's, was understood at the level of basic pharmacology before the drug reached a single patient. It was not unknown. It was unemphasized. The speed and the potency were marketed as virtues. The dependency profile that accompanied them was not disclosed in the clinical language it deserved. The scientific truth about what the molecule did to the GABA system over time was present in the literature from the beginning and was systematically buried beneath 50 double-blind studies measuring what the drug could do in the short term by a company that understood, with great precision, that the short term was where its commercial interests resided. The second betrayal was institutional. A pharmaceutical company engaged over the course of the late 1970s with the scientific and regulatory processes that produced the DSM-III's formal recognition of panic disorder, the precise diagnostic category for which it had already developed the designated treatment. The engagement was legal. It operated through the accepted channels of scientific sponsorship and clinical education and opinion leader cultivation. It produced a genuine scientific literature, genuine peer-reviewed findings, genuine conference presentations given by genuinely credentialed researchers. And it resulted in a situation in which a pharmaceutical company held the approved treatment for a condition whose diagnostic borders had been drawn, at least in part, by the scientific investments of that same company. The institution of modern psychiatry, the DSM, the FDA, the peer-reviewed journal in the continuing medical education system, was not corrupted in any simple sense. It was navigated with extraordinary sophistication by people who understood its architecture and used that understanding to produce an outcome that the architecture was not designed to prevent. The third betrayal was contemporary and is ongoing. The pill that was positioned as the safe alternative to the discredited tranquilizer became, across 4 decades, one of the most widely prescribed medications in the world, one of the most counterfeited pharmaceuticals in America, and one of the primary delivery vehicles for the fentanyl that is killing tens of thousands of people every year in the United States alone. The normalization of Alprazolam, the cultural embedding of the Xanax bar as a familiar, recognizable, ordinary pharmaceutical object, created the specific conditions of familiarity that the counterfeit market required to function. The trust that patients placed in the white rectangle with the scored lines was a trust that had been built by institutions and then exploited by an entirely different category of actor. The harm did not originate with the drug dealers pressing the counterfeit bars. It originated at a structural level that is harder to prosecute, but no less real. In the 40 years of institutional decisions that made Alprazolam the most trusted pharmaceutical shape in American popular culture. The woman in Ohio whose prescription we have carried through this entire history. We do not know what became of her. She is not a documented person. She is a composite, a representative figure assembled from the thousands of documented cases that the clinical literature contains, offered at the beginning of this account as a way of anchoring the abstract history in the weight of an individual life. She is the patient whose physician told her in 1981 that this was not a tranquilizer, who took the pill and felt the relief that the pill genuinely provided, who found in the months and years that followed that stopping was harder than she had been told it would be, whose difficulty was attributed by a system that had not been prepared to see it differently, to the condition the drug was treating rather than to the drug itself. She is every person who swallowed what a trusted institution told them was safe and discovered the limits of that trust in the private, unwitnessed space of their own nervous system. She is, in the darkest extension of what this history has become, the person who purchased a bar they recognized from the outside of it, because recognition had always been sufficient before. Whether the systems that approved and marketed and normalized Alprazolam learned anything from Valium is a question this history has now answered in some depth, and the answer is partial and disappointing, and probably predictable to anyone who has followed the arc of pharmaceutical regulation across the last century. They learned some things. The language became more sophisticated. The evidence base became more elaborate. The clinical infrastructure became more deeply constructed and more self-sustaining. The harms took longer to surface, the reckoning longer to arrive, and the warning longer to issue, which is, measured against the original objective of avoiding a repeat of the Valium scandal, a kind of success, if you are measuring by the timeline of the scandal rather than the scale of the harm. What they did not learn, what the 39-year gap between approval and honest warning, the buried Marks-Swinson study, the 15 million annual prescriptions issued in the same decade as the FDA's most serious safety communication, the counterfeit bars indistinguishable from the pharmaceutical product. What all of that suggests, they did not learn, and perhaps cannot learn within the structure they inhabit, is this. The architecture of harm does not require malice to function. It requires only the alignment of institutional incentives with the short-term evidence of benefit, and the misalignment of those same incentives with the long-term evidence of cost. It requires only that the people making decisions at each point in the chain, the chemist, the marketer, the DSM committee member, the FDA reviewer, the prescribing physician, each operate within the logic of their role, without any single one of them bearing the weight of the full picture. The full picture is the thing that no one in the chain is structurally required to hold. The patients hold it. They hold it in their nervous systems, in the years-long tapers and the withdrawal journals and the support group conversations and the quiet, private reckonings with what it means to have trusted a system that was, at each individual point of contact, doing something that looked like caring for them. They hold it, in the most tragic cases, not at all. Good night. Wherever you are in the world, in whatever hour this darkness has found you, thank you for sitting with this history. It is not a comfortable one. The most important histories rarely are. Rest well.